Thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 474, Kiev is Trapped. Last time, per Hitler's orders, General Guderian's Panzer Group II began racing south to be the northern half of a pincer east of Kiev that would cut off the city from any help and seal its fate. But first, the panzers of Guderian had to get into place. They moved quickly, pushing aside unorganized Soviet resistance until, only after 2 days of travel, they reached the Desna River, which here was flowing west to east. The engineers quickly threw up pontoon bridges, but considering the amount of panzers about to cross, a larger, more stable bridge was preferred. And General Walter Model and his 3rd Panzer Division found such a wooden bridge at Novgorod-Seversky, about 100 miles or 160 kilometers northeast of Kiev. Problem was, it was already rigged to blow. This long bridge already had a 500-pound bomb placed at its center by the defenders. Also, they attached explosives that were hanging off the sides and had gasoline drums underneath, ready to ignite. Clearly, speed was the order of the day if the bridge was to be taken intact. Fortunately for the attackers, they had speed in spades. At 6 a.m., the attack started. Leading the way were Zundap KS 750 motorcycles. Made for rough terrain, they also had a sidecar which held an MG-34 machine gun. As they approached the bridge, the machine guns started firing, forcing the defenders on and behind the bridge to duck for cover. Behind the motorcycles were SDKFZ 251 half-tracks, and within these were Panzer Grenadiers, ready to jump out and attack. With them were engineers ready to neutralize the explosives or incendiaries. As the German motorcycles mounted the first part of the bridge, their leading elements fell, dead or wounded, as the Soviets fired back. But just then, the smoke bombs, shot by German artillery onto the bridge, started sending out plumes of blinding smoke. The half-tracks stopped at the edge of the bridge. The troops jumped out, determined to drive back the enemy. Staying close behind them, the pioneers started cutting detonation wires and the ropes that held the fuel drums. Those that did not fall were pushed over the side. By now, brave Soviet soldiers started climbing under the bridge, holding on to the wooden beams. But they were spotted by the Panzer III tanks below, who opened up with their machine guns. These men started falling. Most were dead before hitting the ground or landing in the river. Still, those about to die did start a few fires, but the ever-attentive pioneers quickly put them out. Now the Germans cleared the bridge of enemy troops and explosives. They made sure none would return. The Soviets, for their part, on their side of the bridge, started firing their artillery, hoping to do with shells what the fire was not allowed to do. Sadly, their aim was poor. An hour after the first German motorcycle had zoomed across the bridge's entrance, the panzers of the 3rd Division started to cross. Just a few days later, on September 6th, parts of the SS Division Das Reich grabbed another bridge over the Desna. The contest pretty much played out as the bridge prior. The Duntap motorcycles, with sidecars and machine guns, went blazing in, followed by brave and experienced German soldiers. But the crown jewel was an iron trestle bridge near Sosita. Scouts had come across it, but as it was metal, the defenders were sure to be more numerous here. Thus, Stuka dive bombers were requested and promised to arrive at 1:30 p.m. But when they were an hour late, Guderian himself, who had just arrived on the scene, ordered his men to move forward regardless. No, the Soviet troops on the far side were not harassed by bombers, but the German motorcycles and half-tracks did the job. The first disgorged bullets at an incredible rate. The second disgorged men at an incredible rate. Soon the explosives were made useless and carried off the bridge. But success normally comes at a price. The price this time was dead Germans. As the men were clearing up, the Stukas finally came, obviously late, and probably feeling guilty, they came in blazing. Soon 10 of their German comrades were dead, with another 30 wounded. Other bridges would be taken as well, but around one bridge, the Soviets intensely counterattacked. Soon the Germans found themselves back on their side, and worse, the Russians were coming across the bridge to keep this drive going. The Germans threw in everything they had, as one report ended by sending in the very last man of the division, in this case the Field Bakery Company. A catastrophe to the right bank was only just avoided. And to make matters worse, the Soviets, who knew what the Germans were up to but failed anyways, would have an even harder time of denying the German pincer attack. Before Guderian could travel any further south, he requested and received another corps, specifically the 46th Panzer Corps. Truly now, when he and his went to help close the encirclement, it would be done with overwhelming force. Thus, the trap was almost set in early September, that is, by Guderian representing the pincer coming from the north, von Kleist coming from the south. Not to mention the Germans that were coming east from across the Dnieper River, and Stalin, as in he who would not allow another retreat. But there was another arrival that early September, that being the autumn Rasputista, the seasonal rains that turned roads into swamps. The good news for the Germans was that, on dry, hot days, the mud quickly dried. Thus Guderian kept his men moving. On September 2nd, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of the area's air operations, flew to Guderian's headquarters to confirm that he was ready. Vast Heinz also confirmed that he was ready. And that's when the Soviet bombers came roaring in. The Russians, not having anywhere near enough tanks in this area to try to stop the invaders, released some of their Ilyushin BD-3 long-range bombers. It has a crew of 3, has a max takeoff weight of 20,000 pounds or 9,450 kilograms, and can reach 273 miles an hour. And yet, run after bomb run only saw more of these shot down, and the panzers were not troubled with meeting their timetable as the 2 massive pincer wings moved in. The last few days of the first week of September, Guderian's Panzer Group 2 probed for weak points, readying for when the order would be given to move out. The Russians fired whenever the enemy came close, but they were unable to move, at least enough to constitute a proper counterattack. Their order from Stalin was to stand fast and keep fighting unto death, theirs or the Germans. A few days later, on September 9th, with a weak point discovered, Model's 3rd Panzer Division attacked. The weather wasn't perfect, nor was their fuel situation, but the men's anxiety and expectations, pent up as they were now released. The first line of Soviet defenders were quickly brushed aside, now many of them dead. These panzers were to continue south until reaching Romny, 143 miles or 230 kilometers east by northeast of Kiev. Meanwhile, von Kleist would be pushing north with his panzers towards Lubny, due south of Romny. If all went according to plan, they would link up in Lokvista, in between Romny and Lubny. But this, of course, only represented the most eastern closing. There would be other forces driving inward, but closer to Kiev, to break up this massive encirclement, of trapped men. Allowing too many men to be in one trap might allow them to punch a hole. This area needed to be controlled by the Germans, which would guarantee a powerful band around Kiev. Thus the ruthlessness. Sensing another victory, Guderian rushed forward to Model's forces. He wanted to be there when they entered Romny, but he almost got much more than he asked for. The good news was that the Germans had arrived there so quickly and had entered the town so quickly that the defenders were not all at their positions, so were overrun. The bad news was that several snipers were still loose in the city, so for now the Germans traveled the streets of the city in half-tracks or they stayed far away, not the picturesque entrance suitable for the history books. But that changed at 5 p.m. when the 46th Panzer Corps, including the fanatic SS Panzer Division Das Reich, arrived. Model had them go in and thoroughly search the town. This drove out the remaining snipers, but they were replaced by rain. Lots of it. Though there was an upside to a foot of mud. One German soldier was crossing the rail line when an enemy shell landed near him. He knew it was all over but the crying, yet the mud muffled the blast. After it went off, the man looked around, felt all over his body for damage, and finding none, went about his business. Meanwhile, von Kleist in the south was having his own spectacular advances, while he and his got into position. Near the city of Kremunchen, 182 miles or 292 kilometers southeast of Kiev, on September 9th, his leading elements crossed the Dneiper River. His men had to use 150 rafts and 68 assault boats, but the 257th Infantry Division made it work. The combat bridge they created in the next few days was 650 feet long, which could hold the weight of panzers. Just before dawn on September 12th, 5 divisions had crossed over. They got lucky in that a massive rainstorm kept things dark and the Soviets' heads down. When the sun was just about to appear for that morning, the German divisions, infantry, and panzers attacked the Soviet 38th Army. The Germans started with a rolling artillery attack that did much better than expected. Soviet troops along the line started falling, and the path to the Soviet general's headquarters was cleared. Soon, German troops burst in and shot up the place. The Soviet general himself had to dive out his back window, but his command was effectively dead. This local success allowed the 3 panzer divisions of the 5 total to push 40 miles that same day. When the sun set, in tow were 13,000 Soviet prisoners, and in their wake were 75 destroyed Soviet tanks. As for the 2 German infantry divisions, they could only cover 12 miles that day, but kept moving north as best they could. And it seemed it was only about to get better. The 16th Panzer Division pushed on until reaching Lubny, close to the meetup point on September 13th. Unfortunately, the defenders there were better prepared, or rather, more desperate. The 16th Panzer ended up retreating a bit to the south, as the losses they started sustaining was not worth the continued advance. Ironically, like the SS divisions, many of these defenders were NKVD troops who were truly committed to Stalin's vision. Overall, the southern pincer of von Kleist was moving faster than the northern pincer of Guderian. As such, General Kurpanov, the Soviet defender in charge of this area, ordered the Soviet 5th and 37th Armies to retreat north, away from von Kleist's men and closer to Guderian's. He didn't believe he was being clever, but simply hoped to add to the woes of the northern pincer. After that, and seeing what was about to happen, he flew out of this burgeoning trapped area and went to Moscow. Coming face to face with Stalin, he begged to be allowed to retreat with as many men as possible, but the premier calmly said no. That was the discussion. There was never a, "No, but you don't understand." Not with Stalin. Kurpanos flew back to Kiev, took command of his men, and awaited the inevitable. A day later, Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov, the Deputy People's Commissar for Defense, tried the same thing. But being a commissar, Stalin expected more of him, and thus allowed his frustration and disappointment to this point to rise to the surface. First, Stalin gave the 5th and 37th Armies permission to move about a bit to provide for a better defense, but they would remain and they would fight. And then Stalin blew his top, yelling at the marshal that he and his did not have enough willpower to do what was needed, that they did not understand their responsibilities properly. This was reminiscent of Stalin during the opening days of Barbarossa, when he was simply overwhelmed and bereft of rational thought. The rain that more or less hindered the panzers went away, seemingly afraid of these war machines. And now that the weather was good, the ground dried, the panzers rolled on. On September 14th, the 3rd Panzer Division under Model advanced south, now close to Lochvista, the meeting point. But just before this moment, Model's panzers came across a large Soviet convoy. Those driving the horse-drawn carts jumped down and ran away. The Cossack cavalry gave battle, as did the 2 T-26 light tanks. But after those 2 tanks were obliterated, the Cossacks disappeared over the closest hill. The rest was just target practice for the Germans. When the 3rd Panzer Division reached Lochvista from the north, they saw the town already under attack by the 16th Panzer under von Kleist, coming up from the south. Seeing this, the 3rd Panzer moved out again. A few Soviet troops ran out from behind trees, fired their rifles at the tanks, but kept running. As if staged, the 3rd and 16th Panzer Divisions met each other in the middle of town. Where's a camera when you need one? The trap had been closed. Now it was just a matter of killing everyone inside of it. But the panzer crews did not look west towards the trapped men. No, they looked east to see who would be coming to rescue their comrades. They had seen this too many times before. And yes, they practically won every one of these contests, but it was never easy, and many good friends had been lost in the process. But what these tank men could not know was that no one was coming to rescue those trapped at or near Kiev. Those men had given everything they had to stop the crossings of the Dnieper and the Desna. They were exhausted and low on supplies. As for men further afield, that was a no-go as well. Stalin was worried about Moscow and kept what he had for that upcoming fight. As incredible as it sounds, for the moment, the Soviet Empire was out of trained men. To be sure, the disaster that was about to hit Kiev was of Stalin's making, and he had studied history enough to know what happens to failed dictators. They don't last long. And though he had screwed up royally, he couldn't help himself from being a bully when a commander sent in a panicked, and rightly so, message. Stalin would mock the man to his staff as panicky. Having said that, Stalin himself left reality on September 13th, when he sent a message to Churchill, again starting out churlishly. It read in part, "If a second front in the West seems unfeasible to the British government, then perhaps some other means could be found of rendering the Soviet Union active military aid against the common enemy." From here, he went on to ask that, say 25 or 30 divisions be dropped off at Archangel or send them to Russia's southern area via Iran, as if any of this was even remotely possible. But the panicked mind doesn't worry about reality. Like the heart, it wants what it wants. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I'm about to take off on my family vacation, but I do have shows already recorded. Woo, that was fun. But anyway, so I've got a couple standalone episodes ready for you, and those will be in my stead, so you won't miss anything. There'll be a show each week that I'm gone. So let's see here. I'd like to say hi to the latest members, if I may. Thank you. John Haskell from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thank you, John. Porter Sago from Goshen, Utah. I hope I got that right. Scott Callender, who sent me some very nice messages. Thank you very much. He is from Manchester, New Hampshire. And Mateusz Dirks from Gdańsk, Poland. I hope I got that right, Mr. Dirks. If I did, let me know. If I didn't, don't tell me. Anyway, so again, I will see you as soon as I can. I get back in about 2.5 weeks, but I think you're going to enjoy the standalone episodes. One of them has a video version of it on YouTube at the History of World War II podcast. Check that out. So if you've ever wanted to see the face that makes the sound, of which I apologize, you can see it there, as always. And hopefully this goes double for me and my family. Take care, everyone.